Alright, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. I am Tricia Sullivan. I'm an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and a member of the governing board for ISSS. And I have the pleasure of being on the selection committee for our Distinguished Scholar Award. I co-chaired that with Barry here, and then we also had Sarah Krebs and Ron Krebs helping us with that selection committee. So I was very pleased to get a chance to reach out to scholars and ask if they would talk a little bit about Charlie. And it was a rare moment where I sent out a request and I immediately got enthusiastic replies back saying, yes, I would love to, thank you so much for asking me. So it was quite a pleasure to have these distinguished scholars here talking about our Distinguished Scholar honoree. So I'm going to let each of them have 10 or so minutes to talk, and then I think Charlie's going to give some reflections, and then we'll open it up. And if those of you in the audience have a few comments or questions, then that would be great. Welcome. So John Mearsheimer will start us off.
It's a great pleasure to be here to honor Charlie. I love these events. I think it's wonderful that we have an opportunity to honor people who have done such great service to the field. And it's also super nice because it's like a reunion. You get to see all sorts of people in one place who you've gotten to know over the years. And it's not often that you can do that. I first met Charlie sometime in the mid-1980s. I was at the University of Chicago at the time, and I had gone to Harvard for what purpose I can't remember. But somebody said to me, I want you to meet Charlie Glaser. So I met him in an office. I can remember that as clear as day. I have no idea what we talked about. But I do remember one thing, and that is that he could talk endlessly. I remember somebody once said to me that what they'd like to see is Charlie and Bob Pape locked in a room and see which one would quit talking first. It was all serious discussion, of course, but Charlie was a deadly serious person who just wanted to talk and talk. And at that point in my life, you know, I could talk for an hour maybe, but not much more than that. But anyway, I managed to extricate myself that day. And I think the next time I remember seeing him was when he came to the University of Chicago. And he came to the University of Chicago in 1991, and he was there until 2009, which is 18 years. And during that period, we became very close. I feel like I know Charlie extremely well. The only person I know as well, and actually a bit better than Charlie, is Steve Walt, and that's because we wrote the Israel-Latvian U.S. foreign policy together, and that drove us, Steve and I, together in ways that I'm sure you can all imagine. But I know Charlie extremely well. He and Steve and I set up PISP, which has lasted for many, many years. We were on countless dissertation committees together. And after Steve left and Bob Pape came, it was Bob, Charlie, and I for many years. And as some of the older people in the audience know, whenever you're on a dissertation committee, and on many dissertation committees, you get to know, the other faculty members really well. So I know Charlie extremely well from all the workshops, all the social events, all the dissertations we were on together. I'd like to say a few words about his background, for those of you in the audience who don't know much. Charlie was actually a physics major at MIT, and he got his bachelor's degree in 1977, and then he took a year off, if my memory's correct, and he went to Harvard to get a PhD in physics. And what's very interesting about that to me, and I've never asked him this, it's kind of funny that I haven't asked him, but he was an experimentalist He was not a theoretical physicist. And if you think of Charlie as a political scientist, he is about as pure a theorist as there is in the land. He's not terribly empirical by his own admission. And I always wondered, but never bothered to ask him, how somebody who was an experimentalist became a theorist when he switched fields. And that, of course, is what he did at Harvard. He ended up getting an MA in physics, but at the same time he hit the eject button and he went to the Kennedy School, first getting a master's degree in public policy and then getting a PhD. He got his PhD in 1983 and then became part of the security community that was emerging at the time that Barry and I were part of. I think it's fair to say that Barry and I were the older part of that community. We came through the system a bit before people like Charlie did, people like Steve Walt, people like Scott Sagan and others. Charlie, when he came out of the Kennedy School, actually did not have much knowledge of political science. He had been a physics major, and he was an expert on nuclear issues, but he had not had much exposure to political science, which is a good thing in a lot of ways, as many of you in the audience know. But anyway, he taught himself the discipline over time, and he wrote a book, his first book, which came out in 1990, Analyzing Strategic Nuclear Policy, which dealt with the nuclear issue. And then, of course, slowly but steadily over time, he moved away in part from the nuclear issue, and he became a major IR theorist. And his well-known book, Rational Theory of International Politics, was published in 2010. He's also written numerous articles in the best journals in the field. My favorite is Realist as Optimist, which, as I always tease him, is a contradiction in terms, but he doesn't seem to understand that. He's also written all sorts of important articles on the security dilemma and a large number of policy issues. Very importantly, he was one of the 33 people, Barry was another one, who signed the New York Times ad against the Iraq War. And he has been, as I say, very active in all sorts of policy issues over time. I'd like to talk about his qualities as a human being. And I'd like to make 4 different points. First of all, he's an excellent administrator. I don't know how many people know that. Some of the people at George Washington have probably seen him up close create the institute there. But when he was at Chicago, he was the acting dean of the Harris Public Policy School from 1994 to 1996. That was the acting dean. And he could have been the real dean had he wanted, but he was not interested in being the real dean. And then he was the deputy dean, the dean's right-hand person, for over 10 years. So he is, I can tell you from personal experience, a fantastic administrator. More importantly, he is a wonderful human being, as I'm sure most of you in the audience, if not all of you, know. I always assess people on this dimension by asking myself a simple question. If I were to die and my children had to be raised by someone else, how would I feel about my children being raised by that person? This assessment, of course, is made on days when I feel good about my kids. And I'm not thinking like my mother, who used to say, the next time I go through life, I'm going through without kids. The opposite. But if I were going to kick the bucket and somebody told me that my children would be left with Charlie and Carol, his wonderful wife, I'd pass away into the sunset feeling really good about that. Because Charlie and Carol, too, were both wonderful people, and the thought of them raising my children after I had passed away would leave me feeling content. In fact, I think if anything, the problem with Charlie would be that he would care too much. I really do think that, and I think he would agree with me. It's the Jewish mother in him. Third point I'd make about Charlie is that he is terrific with students. And again, I've seen him up close on more than one occasion. First of all, he's very caring. He does care about students. He cares that, you know, they make it through the program, that they do well, and he devotes an enormous amount of time to reading their work and criticizing it. And one of the problems that he faces, and he would admit to this readily, I think, is he's a very slow reader. His comprehension skills are kind of slow, but he eventually absorbs what he reads, and he offers wonderful comments. There's in many instances where I went into PhD committee meetings with him, and after I listened to him talk about the dissertation or proposal that was in front of us, I said to myself, boy, I'm glad I'm here with Charlie, because he made comments that, you know, gave me insights that I hadn't seen on the written work in front of us. Very smart comments. And he's also, and this is very important, and it's reasonably unusual in the academic world, he's actually quite tolerant and fair-minded. He's not one of those people who insist that people agree with him. And Keir Lieber is here in the audience, and as Charlie knows well, the dissertation committee that Keir had was me, Steve Wall, and Charlie. And Keir's dissertation was basically a broadside attack on everything Charlie believed about international politics. And Charlie was a good soldier. He helped Keir tighten up that dissertation as much as he possibly could. And he was a real net plus in the whole enterprise. So my third point here is he is really good with students. My fourth point is that he is a super smart individual. This leads to a paradox that I want to end with. But let me just say a few words about how smart he is. He has, I think, one of the finest analytical minds of anybody I know, right? And it's the scientist in him. Every time we get going, I'm always thinking, this guy was a former physicist. You can just see it, right? He doesn't care what the literature says. He just wants to argue through the proposition that's in front of us. If you say something about the security dilemma that he doesn't agree with, he says, let's go back to square one and just work your way through. And he is really just so smart and has such a logical mind. But this leads to the great paradox. How is it that somebody who is so smart disagrees with me on so many issues? I'm hoping he will answer that question when it's up here. I cannot seem to convince this guy that many of his views about international politics are simply wrong. And it's very puzzling to me that anybody who's as smart as Charlie doesn't completely agree with me. Thank you.
Barry Posen up next.
I can't top that, actually. I've been privileged to speak at several events of this kind in recent years, and when I do, I usually take a look at the CV of the person being honored, and these are invariably humbling experiences, and this was no exception. As John pointed out, the extent and breadth of Charlie's scholarship is quite extraordinary. Aside from two major, deeply, and I'm not sure this is a verb, cerebrated works, there's a slew of articles and book chapters. More important than volume, however, is the contribution. Charlie has taken on some of the most theoretically challenging and substantively significant research efforts of our time in the field of international politics. In doing so, he has left rocks in the road. Right? You can't go around these rocks. You have to deal with the rocks he's left in the road. Often I find myself thinking, I should write something about this, or maybe this idea would work. And then I kind of discover that Charlie treated this at one point or another in his career. As I see it, Charlie's wrestled with two big problems, and they're captured in both of his books. In the most recent book, it's just how powerful are the incentives for individual states in the international system to do things that may seem advantageous in the short term, but which could prove quite disadvantageous in the medium and long term. This is basically what John was asking, why does Charlie disagree with John? And so, more pointedly, it's the structure of international politics as linked by structural realists, including the person to my immediate left, propositions that incentivize states to seek power after power, more or less for its own sake. And Charlie basically makes the point that there's important middle-level variables that put a brake on things. For example, those highlighted in offense-defense theory, which Charlie does not invite wholeheartedly, Charlie does not embrace wholeheartedly, but nevertheless, Charlie probably rescued offense-defense theory from what would have been a premature death. I think he's helped keep that theory alive, and I find myself returning to it, so I think it's a good thing that he did. And of course, the second major problem that Charlie has wrestled with is the meaning of nuclear weapons. And he brings to this question not only the powerful deductive logic, but the 2 degrees in physics, which to my knowledge, he has never traded upon for purposes of backfooting people in nuclear policy debates. I've never seen him trade on this. And nuclear physicists trade on it all the time. It's the main thing you have to trade on. So as John was saying, Charlie's a real mensch, and I sometimes wish he would trade on that nuclear physics logic a bit more. He is unparalleled in his ability to surface all the arguments why a nuclear counter-revolution doesn't stand much of a chance. And periodically, when I begin to become concerned about the ebb and flow of nuclear revolution and nuclear counter-revolution arguments, I seek not just counsel from Charlie, but reassurance. Right? We talk each other down when we get concerned about this. Sometimes it takes a little whiskey, but we manage to talk each other down. And as he once pointed out to me when I was waxing poetical about nuclear weapons and was talking about the weapons, Charlie said, no, the problem isn't the weapons. The problem is cities. He says, there just aren't many cities. Most of the wealth and population of countries is concentrated in cities, and they're really, really hard to defend. So that it's not always going to be a lot easier to proliferate bombs than it is to proliferate cities. You've got to understand both sides of the equation. And the whole thing, why didn't I think of this way of talking about it? But since Charlie explained it all to me, I certainly come back to it. Now, Charlie does have quirks, and John talked about a few of his quirks. Occasionally, he falls into a rut. And if you look at his CV, the ruts just jump out at you. Between 2011 and the present, he authored what I'm now calling the Should Trilogy. 2011 Foreign Affairs, should Washington continue its alliance with Taipei? 2016 International Security, should the U.S. reject Man? 2016 book, should the U.S. stay in the Gulf? At some point, one gets it. If Charlie asks the should question about a policy matter, the conclusion is foreordained. The answer is no. You've got to introduce some mystery into these titles, Charlie. Earlier in his career, there was a similar rut. He fell into what I think of as the Why series. Now, the Why series is much more mysterious than the Should series. 1984, why even good defenses may be bad. 1999, why do strategists disagree about the requirements of strategic nuclear deterrence? In 1993, one which I now entirely disagree with, why NATO is still best. Now, I'm sure there's some sort of a relationship between the Why series and the Should series, at least in an epistemological sense. Only after Charlie understands the why of a thing is he willing to take up the shoulds and should nots of the thing. And I said, now this is a valuable model these days. I actually wish more people would do it. Now, it's been my good luck to know Charlie not only as a scholar, but also as a colleague and as a friend. So far as I know, he does not fly off the handle in an argument or discussion. He's quick to appreciate a joke, though more often with an ironical smile than with a belly laugh. If I'm saying something with which he disagrees and I'm on the podium and he's in the audience, he lets me know that he disagrees, but he doesn't twitch around too much. He just kind of puts an eye on me. I have to go find him right afterwards and say, all right, what was it? What was it? Oh, well, maybe we'll talk later. If you've ever dined at his home, those of you who have had the privilege, you know that he and Carol are among the most gracious hosts you could ever hope to have. I mean, it's like you come into the house and suddenly you're just made to feel incredibly comfortable, right? And you don't even have to talk about international politics anymore. You can talk about something else entirely. Right? It's just wonderful to have an evening with them. And finally, I'll just tell one little personal story. It is not widely known that when I first came to MIT, I inherited the office that Charlie had just abandoned as the Center for International Studies in '38. And I can tell you, all the shelves and all the file drawers were completely empty. There was no evidence of human habitation, much less scholarly habitation. It was absolutely immaculate. Charlie, as we know, is inevitably, incredibly thorough, and that office was cleaned out entirely. Now, given the outpouring of work we have from Charlie since then, I really wish you'd have left a few pages of rough draft or something lying around. It could have supercharged my career. So, Charlie, thank you for everything you've done for the profession. I appreciate it.
So welcome, Don Haber.
Those are two very tough acts to follow. But I do have the advantage of being the first Charlie student, so I can say all the nice things about how great a teacher and mentor Charlie is. And you guys have heard it for the first time, and unfortunately the next Charlie student is just going to have to repeat what I said. So I apologize for that. I'm really honored to be on this panel. It's a tremendous opportunity to pay tribute to someone who's been an amazing scholar, an amazing mentor, and a friend. And I consider myself so lucky to have encountered Charlie pretty early on in my academic career. In fact, right at the beginning of my academic career, I'll start with a personal anecdote. I first met Charlie while still a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I was getting a master's in public policy part-time at the Harris School while a ROTC instructor at Northwestern. And I'd just come off a tour as a fast attack submarine officer. I really liked it. It was really fun being on submarines. And you have to understand that that community has this identity. Its whole prestige and frankly its funding was built entirely on tracking and potentially sinking enemy nuclear missile submarines. And unlike our colleagues, the American naval officers who drove the ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, we were the good guys, right? Because we did not have nuclear weapons on board, all right? Our job was to destroy the bad guys with the nuclear weapons on board, okay? So we were on the side of the angels. Now you can see where this is going once you encounter Charlie Glaser. I took Charlie Glaser's national security policy class, where under his instruction, it dawned on me that maybe, just maybe, threatening the opponent's secure second strike capability was an offensive, destabilizing, and indeed a nuclear thing to do. This, for perhaps obvious reasons, given who wrote my paycheck at the time, had never occurred to me. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but I stopped being a naval officer soon after and sat at Charlie's feet for a few more years. I mentioned this anecdote not only to illustrate Charlie's profound influence on me, but also because I'm going to spend my time talking about Charlie's more policy-oriented research. I like this anecdote because it does show the power of logic, okay, and that's really what Charlie brings to any policy question. This analytical ability, this kind of very Vulcan-like approach. And those ideas can change minds, okay? They had a profound effect on me. But of course, there's a selection effect, right? So it had a profound effect on me. I immediately left the Navy and became an academic and stayed in the ivory tower, where this stuff is widely held. So this is another reason why I'm talking about this anecdote. We should not be too confident that we can accomplish much policy change given the selection effect. We talk a lot about the gap, the policy gap in this business these days. There's a lot of money from Carnegie Foundation and other places to bridge the gap. I happen to have the opportunity to go to one of the Bridging the Gap seminars where they take junior faculty and you spend a week in Washington. And you have nice meals and you talk to very smart people, and lots of people come and tell you how to bridge the gap. And the gap is this understanding that we in academia are too busy sitting in our offices writing obscure stuff because our professional incentives are in that direction, right? Because we're obsessed with tenure and we're obsessed with kind of our 20 peers, et cetera. That might be true. But then they start bringing in these guests, right? And first foundations would come in and they say, well, we're really interested in policy relevant research, and we're not interested actually in supporting monographs, we're interested in impact. We're interested in whether you have a meeting with the chief of staff rather than whether you publish in International Security or APSR. Communications directors from universities would say, hey, our job, my job, is evaluated on how many times the university is named in the news over the year, how many thousands of times. Academic publishers, right, are seeking wider audiences. They're not just publishing for libraries anymore. University trustees, and thus presidents and provosts, are obsessed with professors' influence on the real world, okay? policy schools have really metastasized, for better or worse. The number of degrees awarded in policy schools over the past 5 years has gone up by 25%. The number of political science degrees has dropped by 15%. Okay. Think tanks produce terabytes of PDFs every year on any manner of subject, and they're always chasing the next donation. All right? The policy world has created a political economy where almost all the incentives are for people in our business to go in that direction, okay, and to have an impact. And I think one of the things we think about when we talk about an impact, we're measuring the wrong thing, okay? We should be seeking to speak truth to power, right? But if you're measuring impact, okay, you're actually measuring whether power picked up the phone and listened to you, okay? And that's something very different. And the thing that I like about Charlie's work is that I don't think he would rather be right than be read. And I think that's very clear given how much policy influence he has had with his writings, which is actually not that much because we keep on doing things that he thinks we shouldn't. Just to give you a sense of the range, Barry did this to a certain degree. I just want to list some of the titles. And the reason why I'm just going to list the titles, as Barry said, it's actually a really good way of seeing what Charlie's about because he actually speaks in plain English, right? ICBM vulnerability, the cures are worse than the disease. All right, I know what that paper's about. Do we want the missile defense we can build, 1985? Why NATO is still best. This is actually one of my favorite articles by Charlie. If I have time, I'll return to that in a bit. Counterforce Revisited, assessing nuclear postures, reviews new missions. Okay, this was his longtime co-author, Steve Fetter. How oil influences U.S. national security. Rose on the panel here. U.S.-China grand bargain. Should the United States reject MAD? Okay? The thing about these papers, right, is that they're very different than almost every other political science paper written out there, okay, in that they start with a policy question. Okay, most of the time when we read the policy implications of an article, what happens is we write our article, whatever we're going to talk about, and then in the conclusion we sort of say, well, here are the policy implications that we haven't really thought about. With Charlie, he starts with the policy question first. Okay, and if you've had the opportunity to read this stuff, and I really recommend you do, he is relentless. Okay, he considers any possibility that you can think of. I mean, his papers are exhaustive when it comes to policy options. Okay, and then he subjects it to relentless scrutiny. Okay, and eventually he thinks he comes up with the right answer. This is a really unusual approach that not many people do, and I think it's a really useful one. The problem is it is sort of destined to fail in two different ways, right? So one way is, for example, the amount of money we pour into missile defense is massive. Okay, this is when the policy people just kind of ignore what Charlie thinks is the right outcome. Then there are the times when the policy world actually does what Charlie suggests is the right thing to do, which is the expansion of NATO. And then we can see how you can even take the deductively correct policy and still screw it up. And so I think one of the things that we could learn from Charlie's papers is if we look back at the policies and why the policies are implemented or not, and that would be a better way of understanding the gap than actually trying to demonstrate our impact to powerful people with a lot of money. I'll just conclude by saying one of the things that helps me sleep at night when I realize that we don't have much policy impact is that really where we can make a difference and where Charlie makes a difference is in teaching. And not just in his personal mentorship of people at this table, which is immense, but also in the way he writes. And so one of the great things about Charlie's articles is that they're great for teaching. Okay, and I think that's one thing that we don't focus on. And in fact, one of the other things academics are guilty of is we focus too much on research rather than our teaching. Okay, but if we really want to make an impact even on the policy world, that might be the place to go rather than bridging the gap. Thanks a lot.
Next, we've got Julia McDonald.
Well, I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to be participating in this panel honouring Charlie. And as the turnout today would suggest, warm sentiments that we all feel towards him. Now, other members of the panel have already commented or will comment on Charlie's intellectual might and his contribution to the discipline far more eloquently than I can. So instead, I want to spend a few minutes focusing on a different role that Charlie has played in many of our lives. and one that I think is just as important as his intellectual influence. And that is Charlie as a teacher, as a mentor, as a PhD advisor, and as an intellectual community creator. So I first met Charlie when I was a young and very impressionable master's student at the University of Chicago. And for better or worse, I started the master's program at the University of Chicago with absolutely no background in political science, never mind the strange world of international relations that many of us now inhabit. And yet I suddenly found myself in a class with Professor Charles Glaser, learning for the very first time about US national security policy, nuclear strategy, and how this strange thing called ballistic missile defenses actually worked. Now, to say this class made an impression on me is an understatement. Not only was the substance fascinating, as you might imagine, but I got to witness Charlie in his absolute element, calmly but carefully laying out the logics of different arguments, responding carefully and calmly to all student questions, however mundane they might have seemed, and carefully teaching us how to dissect scholarly arguments, reveal underlying assumptions, and unearth faulty premises. Now, I'm not going to publicly admit to stalking Charlie after my Chicago time, but I will say that having learned so much from him once, I was delighted when he joined the faculty at GW in the early years of my PhD studies. And as one might expect from an overly eager graduate student, my excitement at Charlie's arrival translated into a bundle of nervous energy that led to many embarrassing encounters, not least of which was me clumsily insisting that Charlie must become my PhD advisor, forgetting that it was my job to first convince him that he might want to do this voluntarily of his own free will. Never one to let down a desperate student, however, Charlie kindly agreed to take on the challenge. Some several years later, I imagine he regretted that decision every time he tried to compel me to finish my long overdue dissertation. It goes without saying that having Charlie as my PhD advisor changed the course of my and many other students' journeys. His own work and commitment to standing by arguments that run against the grain, seen both in his work on defensive realism and more recently in his writings on Taiwan, inspired us to ask big questions and not be afraid of sticking to our guns when pushing back against seemingly established views. Charlie's own clarity of thinking, his commitment to sound logic and deductive theorizing, and his meticulous attention to detail influenced the way all of us thought not only about our own dissertation topics, but about political science scholarship more broadly. I recall many occasions when I walked into Charlie's office confident that I prepared answers to every question he could possibly throw at me, and was quickly floored by the most basic but fundamental inquisition. What, Julia, do you mean by a state's resolve? What is credibility? And what exactly are state signals? And I'd slink back to my desk once more to think more carefully and systematically about concepts that I'd clearly taken for granted. And I've no doubt that through this process, though occasionally I'll admit it was a little painful, that Charlie's way of thinking made me and many others much better scholars. Perhaps even more notable, however, was the way in which he delivered his critiques, always with respect for his students' efforts and never mean-spirited. Instead, he went to great pains to couch his feedback in positive language, taking care not to embarrass or belittle. For graduate students like myself, with a fragile self-esteem, Charlie's thoughtfulness always meant a great deal and kept me feeling motivated and encouraged, even when faced with sometimes significant setbacks. Yet Charlie's a distinctive advisor in ways that reach far beyond just his intellectual legacy, and speaking to many of his former graduate students who are in the audience today, reminded me of some of Charlie's special qualities. Perhaps the one that stands out the most is that Charlie lets his students be their own people, both academically in terms of choosing dissertation topics, but also in terms of their life trajectory more broadly. As one former student put it, Charlie sees us as whole people, not just as PhD students, and this shapes his style of advising and mentorship in important ways. It's rare, I think, to find a senior professor, and one as busy as Charlie, who cares as much about their student lives outside of the university setting. But Charlie always took an interest in our broader existence, inquiring about partners, life goals, and even hobbies outside of the classroom. For example, after Charlie and I discovered our shared interest in English soccer, of all things, I soon found myself sitting with him and his son in a dingy Irish dive bar at 10 a.m. with a pint of beer watching a Manchester United match. Not perhaps where you would expect to find the esteemed Professor Glaser on a Sunday morning in Washington, D.C. His interest in our lives also shaped the career advice that he gave us. He's always shown strong support for his students' career goals, whether in academia or, God forbid, elsewhere. He points out postings to students that are uniquely suited to their interests. And he's always quick to lay out in typically systematic Charlie-esque fashion the relative pros and cons associated with any job offer, however good it might initially appear. As a Charlie student, you never doubt that he's invested in your success as a person, not just an academic, and that he cares deeply about your happiness and the path your life will take. This genuine interest in and care for others' well-being is a quality that's so valuable but rarely rewarded in our profession, and I'm very glad that we have the chance to acknowledge it today. Of course, Charlie hasn't only influenced his own PhD students. In setting up the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies at GW, he's managed to influence students and scholars from universities around the country. And it's quite incredible to think about what Charlie has accomplished at GW in such a short space of time. In less than a decade, he's established the ISCS as a top security institute rivaling others with much longer histories. In setting up the institute, Charlie not only assembled a group of incredibly talented faculty and predoctoral students, but he's also gone to great effort to create a unique intellectual community that encourages serious, rigorous scholarship in a collaborative and supportive space. The Institute has not only generated cohorts of junior scholars who benefited from Charlie's thoughtful feedback, but the weekly workshops also gave us front row seats to seeing Charlie in action, whether it was delivering the most damning of critiques in the nicest possible way, a skill Charlie has perfected often to the oblivion of even the presenter, cracking dry, witty jokes to lighten the mood of the room, or watching Charlie frown in puzzlement as he struggles to understand the logic of an argument being presented. It's never a good sign, I can assure you. It's of note that during these workshops, Charlie never speaks first or dominates the conversation, and always makes sure to allow more junior faculty and students the opportunity to participate first. His self-awareness of his position and restraint in overly influencing the course of discussions is just one example of the ways in which Charlie has fostered an inclusive environment at GW. Now, since many of us know that there are few things that make Charlie Glaser squirm more than somebody being gushy and overly sentimental, I'm going to wrap up my comments here. But to summarize in stealing the words of a former Institute fellow, Charlie is one of the most fundamentally decent, good people in this business. No hidden agendas, no ego, all substance. Charlie, your mentorship and advising has reached far beyond the walls of the universities that you've worked at, and you've created a generation of scholars who aspire to be as thoughtful, kind, and influential as yourself. I think I speak on behalf of many in this room in thanking you not only for your contributions to the discipline, but for being an outstanding example of what a distinguished scholar should be. I, for one, will always be grateful for the day you agreed to chair my committee, and I'll look forward to looking to you for guidance for as long as you'll give it. Thank you.
I'll give the next remarks.
Okay, excuse me. So I could say lots of positive things about Charlie as a person, and what a great guy he was, what a terrific mentor, all that thing. But I think that's been covered very well. So I would like to focus instead on Charlie's contribution to, and the policy has already also been covered well. There's a ton of stuff on nuclear strategy. So I'd like to focus my comments on what I take to be, for me anyway, Charlie's biggest contribution to international relations, which is the theoretical contribution. And in particular, I want to focus on one article, Realists as Optimists, Cooperation as Self-Help. This came out in 1994, and I want you all to sort of bring your minds back to 1994. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Pavement, Tupac, Giants Walk the Land, right? This was a magical era, a moment that we can barely recapture in our minds. And I would like to suggest to you that Realists as Optimists was one of these sort of earth-shaking things of that period that we must strive to recapture. Indeed, Charlie has written so much that to pick out this article must seem to him like for many of these great bands, they're playing their one big hit, over and over again. 20 years later or something, this is definitely his, Jumpin' Jack Flash or something like that. But because it's from the early 90s, I like to consider it, this is Charlie's Smells Like Teen Spirit. Ulysses Optimist is Charlie's Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's a mega hit. So we have to cast our mind back. And in doing so, I hope to answer the question that John so eloquently posed at the beginning, why someone so smart as Charlie could disagree with John Mearsheimer. So remember, this comes out at around the same time as John's Back to the Future and False Promise of International Institutions, Jim Theron's Rationalist Explanations for War, Randy Schweller's Bandwagoning for Profit and Realism Status Quo Bias, and Alex Wentz, Anarchy is What States Make of It. All these things came out in this sort of mid-90s period, and they were all very important in answering a fundamental question: what are the implications of anarchy for international relations? And they all played an important role, I think, in getting the modern answer to that question right. And I would say that early realists had been a little bit unclear about this topic, right? If you go back to Morgenthau, he had argued that states seek power, and that it's the competition for power that leads to this sort of dispiriting regularity of conflict in the international realm. So we would understand their actions if we just think of them as pursuing power. But other people criticized that and said, well, is power really an end in itself, or is it a means? John Hertz had coined the term the security dilemma to describe this predicament in which when one side tries to increase its security, it can decrease the security of the other side, which leads to this suboptimal outcome. Herbert Butterfield, a historian, had developed many of the basic ideas behind what subsequently became the spiral model. And then Jervis in the 70s, in his 76 book on perception and misperception, and his 78 article on the security dilemma, really developed these ideas further, making this link between the severity of the security dilemma and the offense-defense balance and other factors. But then, I would argue, in 1979, Ken Waltz comes on the scene and fundamentally distorts our understanding of this question. Right? So Waltz comes along in his 79 book, and he's got a much more thorough, sort of specific, although in my argument, incorrect understanding of this, in which he argues that states, number one, seek security. Security is the goal that you need to pursue if you're in an anarchic situation and you need to defend yourself. So not power. Power is a means to an end. He acknowledges that. But he basically then goes on to sort of elide that and say that the search for security leads to the search for power, and that therefore being zero-sum leads to all these negative outcomes. So the states under anarchy end up seeking power, and that leads to competition. And that became the realist answer to the question, right? That was uncritically accepted as the realist answer to the question. So in grad school, as I came to graduate school in the late 80s in Chicago, the theoretical landscape was clear, right? Realism had this sort of ironclad set of causal arrows: anarchy, security, power, war, or at least conflict. Realism predicted conflict. Liberalism said, but that's all right, but institutions can ameliorate that. Constructivism said, well, kind of, but states can develop shared institutions. That's Alex Wentz's idea. But realism predicted conflict. And that was just very clear. So even opponents of realism accepted that interpretation of realism as being correct. And I very well remember sitting in John's class in IR theory, and we read Ken Waltz for the first week. And I raised my hand and said, but it's wrong, right? It's just logically incorrect. And I said, revealing my future tendencies, I'll bet you could write a model of this that would show that that's not right. And John said, Andy, we need to move on. And so I had this persistent sense of dissatisfaction. There's something wrong with the logic here, but we're all just sort of sliding quickly over it, and it's just an inch deep, not really engaging very deeply with the logic of the argument, both critics and adherents alike. And so I thought there was a problem there, right? Theron's 95 article comes along and says sort of a different formulation of the problem, bringing in bargaining theory and sort of recasting our understanding of the causes of war. But he basically assumes that everybody wants more, right? His fundamental assumption is everybody wants more. It's all about bargaining about how much you get. Implicitly, everybody wants to take over the world, which struck me as a rather inaccurate assumption as well. But then Charlie, in his 94 article, Realist is Optimist, right? To my mind, he gets the answer basically right in the macro sense. He tells us what the answer should look like, right? He argues basically Jervis had a better understanding of Waltz's question than Waltz did. If anarchy mandates the search for security, what then? Under some conditions, you might want to compete, you might want to maximize power, but on others you might not. Right? Arms races can be won as well as lost. And if you're risk averse, you might prefer an arms agreement that can be verified to a more risky arms race, which you might win, but you might lose. So that's one fundamental argument from that paper. He brings in the offense-defense balance, the offense-defense distinguishability, drawing from Jervis and from other literature on that topic. Under some conditions, a very relatively stable, bearable defense burden might be preferable to an arms race that might lead to more offensive capabilities, etc. Personally, I'm not as huge a fan of the offense-defense distinction as Charlie is, but I think the basic thrust of the thing is right. And he introduces, or at least reinforces, this distinction between security-seeking states and what he calls greedy states, or revisionist states, right? And that's a fundamental distinction. It's not absolutely original to him, but he brings it in and shows the theoretical importance on it, right? So that article, to my mind, is what kind of blows open this notion that realism automatically predicts conflict. And he calls it contingent realism, his position. But it sort of opens the door to a lot of subsequent stuff, right? Mandy Schweller then goes on to argue that with a world full of security seekers, you actually not have conflict, right? There's no security dilemma in a world full of security seekers because everybody can be secure, right? Security is actually not a zero-sum goal. It's a positive-sum goal. Everyone can be secure. So there's got to be something else at work. And one of the important things is, of course, uncertainty about motivations, right? Fear, mistrust. I pick up that sort of thing in my subsequent work. I would say this even influenced John's work to the following extent, in the sense that early iterations of John's work, he didn't focus on uncertainty about motivations. But in the 2001 book, he basically acknowledges that a world of security seekers would be peaceful, and you need uncertainty about motivations to drive the kind of conflictual logic to get Waltz's conclusions out of Waltz's assumptions, right? You need that fundamental uncertainty. You can never trust anyone enough to cooperate. And of course, Sebastian Rosado went on to write this article in IS recently saying that the intentions of great powers are inscrutable, and Charlie and I had a response to that. So this battle is sort of still being fought out in pages of journals. So for me anyway, summing up, the key theoretical innovation or sort of contribution, the big, the big smells like teen spirit moment is realist as optimist. That's where he kind of busts open, he separates realism into offensive and defensive realism, we would call it that, and problematizes this big question: what are the actual implications of anarchy, logically speaking? I think he did a great job at doing that and really influenced the field subsequently. It's a big impact on my intellectual life, certainly, and I think a lot of other people in this room. I'll leave with that.
Welcome up our last commenter before we give Charlie a chance to respond, Rose Collette.
Thank you so much. As it's already been said, it's such a privilege and a pleasure to talk about Charlie and to see him get this honor when he's somebody who so deeply deserves it. And thinking about what to say, I was really struggling because Charlie means so much to me and has done so much for me that it's like, how do I sum that up in 5 or 10 minutes and really do it justice, right? And so I was thinking about it, and sometimes when I've tried to explain Charlie to other people, I'll put my foot in my mouth right away, because one of the really distinctive things about him is that he's this combination of being incredibly bright, I mean just incredibly bright, but also such a wonderful human being. And I try to sort of explain that to somebody, and I'm like, there's a lot of people who are smart, and there's a lot of people who are nice, but Charlie's like so smart and so nice. And as I see it, I can see the face of the person I'm talking to changing, like they're thinking like, so you're saying I'm not smart? Are you saying I'm not nice? It's like, no. There are lots of smart people and nice and smart. Oh, geez, But it really is true that I've never met anybody smarter than Charlie. I really haven't. I've never met anybody nicer than Charlie. Right? So he maxes out on both categories, which is just awesome. So I hope I have not made enemies of all of you in this room. But in thinking about, how to think about Charlie, I asked myself, WWCGD, like, what would Charlie Glaser do? And so I decided to think about it like a rational baseline, right? Because, among many things that he's written, rational theory, international politics, he has this rational baseline, which is a concept that I have found really influential and useful in my own thinking. So from a rational baseline standpoint, what should a scholar do? Well, and what should a scholar be, right? If we're talking from a strictly rational perspective, Charlie's pretty irrational, actually, right? Because he's not egoistic, right? He's incredibly generous, right? He's altruistic, right? So, I could say on the one hand, Charlie sort of goes against his own theory because he's not a rational actor in just the very barest sense of it. But if we think of the baseline as what a scholar should do, right? What Plato's scholar would be like, right? I really can't think of somebody that fits that category more than Charlie. So in terms of, what does the Platonic ideal of a scholar or distinguished scholar do? It's somebody who shapes the field, right? Shapes the field in a broad range of topics, which Charlie certainly has done over his career and is still doing, right? Whether it's nuclear weapons that he's talking about, or grand IR theory, oil, China, he really has looked at many topics and has said something, more than one thing, really intelligent about all of them. And that's also, I think, pretty rare. But I think he's also shaped the field with his theory book, right? To me, that's maybe the I don't know if I want to say team spirit, I don't know. That's the under pressure, perhaps, right? Like, what's the best song ever? Like, maybe that's his big thing. But just this whole concept of thinking about rationality as not being something that you impute from outcomes is something that now seems obvious, but is something that we often do and have done. And Charlie, I think, was really good in separating those things out, right? So you can have a situation where a state does something and it looks like they fail, right? The outcome is negative, and it's really tempting to then think it was a mistake, right? The country was irrational because it started a war and it lost the war, right? Or it attacked a country and it didn't defeat it. But Charlie, steps back from that and basically says, you can't just impute rationality from outcomes, right? Because it could be that all the outcomes were going to be bad, and this was the best the state could do, right? It could also be that the state did the thing that would maximize its expected value equation and got unlucky, right? And so the way that he just analyzes things, right, his framework that he applies to the world, looks instead about, what was known at the time, what should a state do, and then, in the ideal circumstance, and then what did the state do, right? And it gives us this rational baseline against which to compare what states have actually done. Just something that, again, it seems sort of simple now, but I think is really powerful and important. Moving on, I think a great scholar also has responsibility to the field, which Charlie has certainly discharged in the most honorable ways. He's trained students. I'm one of his students. He's raised money for other people, right? It's great to raise money for yourself, but he's raised money to fund pre-doctoral students, graduate students at GW, other faculty, right, and his own work as well, but not just his own stuff, right? And I think Charlie's been an excellent teacher, right? He teaches by example, which is the best way to do it, and not by example like don't do what I'm doing because he teaches by good example, not bad example. He asks great questions, and actually on the should point, so at least on the Persian Gulf book, like it really was an open question. Like if the answer was should the U.S. leave the Gulf, and the answer was no, like we would have said no. It's somewhere in between, right? But you know, Charlie asks great questions and he doesn't go into it with a particular idea of how it has to come out, right? He sort of approaches it at face value and goes through the thinking of how it should come out, right? He doesn't predetermine the answers. He's incredibly respectful when he makes critiques. His critiques are, you know, often devastating, but, you know, not given in a devastating kind of way. And as I said, he's incredibly generous with his time in terms of reading papers and reading work. He's read stuff of mine. I wrote a paper about Carl Schmitt, who's this kind of like obscure German theorist of the 1930s. You know, Charlie read it, gave me like awesome comments on it, which, you know, like that might not have been a paper he ever would have wanted to read just for the sake of reading it, you know, but he did, right? So in closing, I just, you know, I can't say enough good things about Charlie. I'm so glad to see him recognized, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
To give some of his own reflections and comments.
Thank you, and thanks for so many of you for coming. I recognize many, but not all faces. And I'd actually be just going to say thank you and call it a day, but they told me I need to speak for around 10 minutes, so I'm going to try. I heard many kind and surprising things, and I was glad to hear. The one thing that didn't surprise me was that John Mearsheimer does not understand why I disagree with him. And the thing I don't understand is why he can't figure it out. But that's been a long story. So I'd like to thank the panelists for their kind words. As you all know, sometimes your harshest critics are your closest colleagues, and so it's nice to hear the flip side of the comments, and you also know that some of the times the harshest comments and closest critics are the most helpful. So thank you for all that, and I've gotten that, you know, over many years. You've had me with John and Barry over many decades. I want to quickly thank other colleagues, and I could just say thanks, but I'll go through a few stages of my life. I had terrific faculty colleagues at Chicago and now at GW. I would like to say that we've lost a few colleagues at GW, and Keir Lieber, whose dissertation I didn't agree with, stole those colleagues. So it occurs to me now, if I had just not let him get his degree, that I would have actually been better off, but I didn't know that 2 decades ago. I mean, I had some thoughts at the time, actually, but... And so anyway, I want to thank those colleagues. I'd like to thank former students who are now colleagues, except for Keir, and many other of my current students. As John described, as a PhD student and as a young postdoc at the Kennedy School, I actually know nothing about international relations coming in, because I came as a physics undergrad and had spent a little bit of time in physics. So I came to the Kennedy School and I had a great deal to learn. And I was incredibly lucky that I ran into a group of people that were very, very helpful to me in learning that. And a few of them are in the room: Steve Miller, Steve Wall, Lynn Eden, maybe a few others that are out there. I also did run across Barry and John even in those days. So I learned a lot from them, and I sort of learned some of what I needed to learn, even if I didn't learn it. And they told me there's this whole field of IR theory that you've never taken a course in. So I am sort of mostly self-taught in that way. But they also had a great deal to offer besides simply knowing the theory. I mean, it was a time in which they were asking big questions, and that was exciting to me. I came into this with policy interests, and it was exciting that people were actually asking questions that I thought were important and exciting, and particularly in retrospect, they were also very excited about the work. And the Cold War sort of energized things, I think. It gave all these questions a certain degree of importance. But it was also a very smart and energized group, and I think that really helped me along, both in terms of deciding what I wanted to do. I didn't know if I wanted to be an academic. I sort of came into this wanting to do policy, and I think they encouraged me in those ways. They also set really high and I think really good standards. So first, big questions are good to ask. You can't always answer them, and sometimes we shouldn't ask the biggest questions, and not all of mine certainly have been, but I think that's good guidance. But also the expectations were that you did really good work, the best work you could do. And that didn't mean getting things, perfect, because you never do, but well on the flat of the curve. So books and articles had to meet a high standard, and it takes a kind of persistence on the one hand to hang in and also a kind of impatience because you need to get done. So there's sort of balance between really working hard but really planning to get done sometime is a tricky thing. I think things have changed a little bit. I mean, we were lucky at the time, and Mearsheimer's got theories for everything, so we can explain why this is the case. I can't explain why it's the case. By the way, he's often wrong, but he always has an explanation. We didn't need to publish quite as much. And now I often people say, is this good enough for a journal? Have I gotten it to, or is it good enough for a journal? We didn't ask that question. The question was like, is it worth doing, and is it almost done? Have I done almost all I can do on it? And I still think that's a great way to think about it. And it's a little bit against the grain. It doesn't maximize your publications. I do think it hopefully maximizes your contribution. And so those are values I adopted. And I think I learned them there from people that really were deeply dedicated to advancing knowledge in our area. And I've tried to pass that along to my students and as a teacher. Another formative place or period for me was Chicago. When I had the great pleasure of being there with John. Walt was there for a few years. Many other very good faculty were there and left, and others came. Chicago has the label of being an intellectually intense place, and it really is. It's a little bit hard to say why. You don't know quite where it comes from. Nobody tells you, your intensity level is too low today. You need to pick it up. But it's sort of in the air, the water. I don't know what it is, but it's just an intellectually intense place, and it does drive you forward. I think it makes you strive to do your best work. It can sort of wear you out, drain you. But overall, it was really a great opportunity and experience to be there for the better part of 20 years, and I did a lot of my good work, or hopefully it was good work there. So I think that that was very good for me. I learned the value of workshops, which is one thing we brought to GW, where productive criticism and occasional destruction of research in progress is a necessary event. And I've been on both sides of that, although I sort of, hopefully on the destructive side, was never, I guess from what people said, I was never mean, but. And there's also the importance of regular engagements with students and faculty. I mean, it turns out, like one thing I've often said, and it's not quite true, is no single workshop is worth it. Like, you can almost always learn more or get something more done in those 2 hours, plus the hour it takes to read the paper. Once in a while, that's not the case, but it's usually the case. But the whole collection of going to that workshop every week for semesters, when you learn about your students, they learn about you, you learn about how to purport yourself as a younger person, or maybe even not how to purport yourself as a more senior person. And you learn how to ask good questions. I try to sometimes explain to somebody in a way that's polite that was not, they're asking a lot of questions, but they're not good questions. So regular engagement really builds scholarly community and also personal community. Partly because we're all really busy. We don't have time to sort of get together for lunch and coffee all the time, but if you have a weekly workshop, you see people every week. And I've gotten to the point where I can usually ask other people's questions for them. I know what they're going to ask. I know how they think. I know what their questions are going to be. I don't know if I could answer them, but at least I could ask them. And I also at Chicago learned how to get work done, or try to get work done, when you have administrative demands, teaching demands, childcare. I wouldn't say they were demands, but responsibilities. And the basic solution is you have to hire. And so I adopted or got a small office in Regenstein, which is the library there. I had no phone, no email, didn't have a cell phone. Steve Walt did this also. We used to pass in the halls there, sometimes up in the corridors of the library, and you just have to go there. And so I got up every morning early if I could, and would go there and stay until I was going to be creating a crisis if I didn't leave and go do some administrative thing or teach my class. So I didn't create too many crises, but it's actually quite a tense kind of situation. I call it like you have to be strategically behind. You've got to put everything aside, try to get your work done, and then do all the other things you have to do to be responsible. But they sort of you have to put them right to the edge. And the other thing at Chicago is I had great students, as well as at GW. But I remember one seminar in particular at GW where I know I was working at least as hard as the students. And the reason was that I knew if I didn't go in there really prepared, I wouldn't be able to hold my own. And so you go in partly out of self-protection and get ready. I've had a great time at GW, except for Kier's damage to my security group. We've built a really good institute. We've run a regular workshop. We've tried hard and I think done well training students. We've had pre-docs, many who it's been a great pleasure to interact with. And so thanks to all of you, students, faculty, friends, of which many of the friends are, students and faculty are. So thank you for all of that. A different thing I want to talk about really briefly is the field of security studies. Because I think it's a terrific field to be in. And the key reason is it's been touched upon, but it really is a field that for many people, they really, even sometimes though they may lose track of it, it's really driven by policy interests. It's by far the most policy-oriented of the subfields in political science, which I think is a great thing. And even though I think John Caverly is right, we don't have as much influence as we'd like, in a variety of ways we do have influence. And I think that's terrific. But it doesn't mean the field is only policy-oriented. It has deep respect for theory as well as policy, and for policy analysis. I know it's not true in all departments, and there's some sort of contestation between people that are too policy-oriented and not purely theory-oriented or purely theory testing-oriented. But somehow there are plenty of us, and it's sort of the size of the section at ISA, and maybe the number of people here are testimony to that. So even though we're a bit of an outlier in political science, so we're still sort of hanging in there, and in some places thriving. Probably should be thriving in more places than we are. But nevertheless, I think it's a great field, and the fact that if we don't fully fit into all the trends of modern political science, then that's actually a tribute to the field. I think it's also a really great field because, and high quality field because it does respect a variety of theory. Sometimes it is considered a bastion of realism, with good reason I would say, but in fact there are many, many other theories that play very important roles in the field. And I think in the Cold War, realism may have been privileged a little bit by the nature of the problem that we were studying. Certainly the end of the Cold War opened up the field very broadly. But I'm not going to go through a long list, but important work is being done these days at all levels of analysis, whether it's the leaders or regime types or structure or interaction between levels, all very important work. To a credit, I think, to the field once again, people have found theories and reached for art explanations that help them explain the problems they need to understand. And in the end, that's really the test. If the theory is the best available to answer the question I need to answer, then we endorse it as a field. And that doesn't mean we always agree about what the best theory is or about what the best approach is, but that's actually unavoidable. And some of the best work in the field is trying to figure out in a productive way which type of approach, which theory is most productive. And I think that's healthy and to some extent unavoidable. Just a little slightly more negative reflection on some things, but not on the field, is that security studies, as I've alluded to, is not always entirely protected from sort of the ways of certain departments. And as Andy mentioned explicitly, I tend to be an optimist about anarchy. I also tend to be an optimist about social and professional relations. And so I sort of maybe underestimate some of the assault that security studies has faced it sometimes. Once again, John's always reminding me, so I get balanced out that way. But I'm just going to say, but every once in a while I do get a sort of sharp reminder that there are people out there that don't like security studies, or at least they don't like realism. And those are sort of often conflated. They're not one and the same, as I said, because there's really important work from realists. But without going into it, every once in a while I get a letter, a recommendation letter that just is like so odd. And so I'll just, without going, this is not a direct quote, but something like this, a letter that goes something like, even though realists rarely have anything useful to say, I have a student that is an exception. Really? Like, first of all, who would write that letter? I mean, what do they think people will think when they read it? Do they think, oh yeah, that's right, this guy must be great, or like it's the person that wrote it? Like, but anyway, the person must think lots of people would be receptive, because otherwise, why would they write that letter? But anyway, so I've gotten a few of those over the years, so that sort of takes the veil off of, sort of what's out there, because presumably it's not well, first of all, I've seen it from more than one person, but there must be other ones hiding that know better than to write such a letter. I don't know. So, but in any event, for all that, the field and I think and realism are both healthy, and I think the field is overall, doing great. So, for the future, this is my last point. I mean, I think that the good news is the bad news, because the good news is that security studies is going to be in business for a long time. And that's because of the bad news out there in the real world. Bad news is good news for security. And many people at the end of the Cold War thought that security studies was going out of business. That didn't happen, partly because the field was able to respond in a way because new dangers came about. They weren't the major power dangers, and the field responded. So we have tremendous work on, among other things, civil war, and then on terrorism. But major power, potential conflict never went away, and now it's back. And so if the others, if the other dangers weren't enough to give the field energy and respect, even in hostile political science departments, probably the return, not so surprising to some of us, more to others of us, of major power competition and potential danger should keep the field healthy for the foreseeable future. So with that, I say look forward to continuing to work with all of you and contributing to this effort, and thank you.
I do want to open it up, and if you want to say something, please tell us your name, and I'll just call on whoever has something to say.
Hi, Steve Walt. First of all, I want to congratulate Charlie for a richly deserved award and congratulate the panel for those great comments. I want to do an anecdote and then a question for Charlie. The anecdote is that nobody knows here because Charlie and I have suppressed it for years, but we actually tried to write a paper together once. In 1983, Charlie has undoubtedly suppressed the memory. We tried to write a paper on what nuclear strategy should be, how you would actually use nuclear weapons. And I'm willing to take the full responsibility for the fact that it was a really terrible paper. We put it aside after one draft and went on to reasonably successful careers. The question I want to ask Charlie, and it's not based on that anecdote, is over your long and incredibly impressive career, what have you changed your mind about? That's a serious question because we all are wrong about various things over the course of our career. We sometimes should reflect on what are the things we got wrong, were mistaken about. I'd just be curious what Charlie's, I believed this in the 1980s and I don't believe this anymore.
I do remember, I think I still have a draft of that somewhere, but
Burn it.
I haven't been wrong about anything.
I asked you, not John.
Well, I'm not quite wrong, but there is, I think, well, one thing is, because the Cold War focused us so much on mutual vulnerability, I would say I gave much less attention to the logic of nuclear weapons outside of mutual vulnerability. And now that's gaining a lot more attention. So, and I think the issues they're related, they're consistent with the arguments, the broad arguments that underpin the sort of mad nuclear revolution logic, but they actually play out in rather different ways. And so, on that one I wouldn't say wrong, I'd say though that I didn't realize how different, I didn't think about them, like how do you really think about damage limitation when it's partially feasible? And it raises other related questions that were unexamined. And I guess I would have said I was wrong in a sense, so I didn't think there were as many unexamined questions out there. I will say that the world is changing enough that I'm still quite sure that there's one claim of I don't think it's a nuclear revolution claim, but that the possibility that major powers would compete and not easily maintain retaliatory capabilities is changing. And I think we're actually in a debate about this, and it's somewhat of a technical question and somewhat of a political question, but I think we'll get to the same outcome. I think we're going to end up, if you get in a competition over long term with China or Russia, that large retaliatory forces will prevail. I mean, that will be the outcome. But it is going to get increasingly hard, and it could get even harder than that. And that's something I didn't anticipate. I sort of thought it was a little more fixed than it is. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Stuart Cobb from the University of Delaware. So I'd like to just say a word about Charlie's underrepresented but terribly important Michigan years. I was a senior graduate student in the late 80s when Charlie was there. And I mean, I can't bring out any new kind of insights about Charlie, but I've got an anecdote that I think nicely illustrates both, the incredible scholarship that Charlie always represented, and the incredibly kind human being that was creating it. So we had this weekly seminar, and I'm pretty sure it was in that context that we read a piece of Charlie's that eventually became part of analyzing strategic nuclear strategy. And I was reading through it, and there was some comment made in a footnote about the prospects of nuclear winter. And I was reading through it, and I said, hey, wait a minute, I've seen some stuff that casts them down on that nuclear winter stuff. So I went up to Charlie and I said, hey, you know what, I think you missed that. And Charlie very kindly responded, and yeah, that's a good point. And I felt great about myself, and then I went back to it and realized that I hadn't finished reading the damn footnote. And the second half of it, he had already acknowledged that. All right, so the scholarship piece, of course, is that he knew all of that, which is totally unsurprising. But the personal piece is that he let me not realize that I had screwed up. When any normal person, including myself, would have said, "I said that." Okay, you need to read the whole thing. The other thing I got out of Charlie is this point about how important it is to ask big important questions. At Michigan at this time, there were lots of different models of what kind of a scholar you could be. You could be the monomaniac who's got one theory that explains the whole world, and his office was over there. And you could be the totally methodologically driven person who says, "Show me a good data set, and I'll make something out of it." And his office was over there. But I was in the generation of people who, I think I saw Sean Jones in this room, famously FBG, screwed by Gorbachev. So after my dissertation was done, I had to, on the Soviet military, of course nobody cared about after 1991, I had to do something else. So I ended up gravitating towards the biggest, most important question I could find, which I like to summarize as why large groups of people get together to kill each other, aka ethnic civil wars. So thank you, Charlie. You were an inspiration in multiple ways.
Okay, all right. Thank you all so much, and thank you to our panelists, and it was wonderful to get to hear all of this about Charlie. And please do come back for the reception.